our hosts, we have agreed with our hosts that we will talk for about half the time about our book, which was published about 1.5 years ago now, Global Governance of Education. Many of you might know it already or not, but in any case, we'll talk about that about half the time, and then the other half we will talk about some new research that we have been doing, and some other issues that have come up that we think are important to talk about. So let me get started with an introduction to the book. So the book provides two novel perspectives in our view. It pays close attention to the historical trajectories of these three organizations that we discuss in the book, UNESCO, the OECD, and the World Bank. And rather than treating them separately, the book examines the historical entanglements and relations between them, and how they struggled over authority in the global governance space, how they dealt with similar issues, and so on. And methodologically, the book draws on archival research that we conducted in several archives around the world, as well as about 40 interviews. And the rationale for the book was that UNESCO, the OECD, and the World Bank have built their legitimacy on promising the achievement of a range of societal goals. But it could be argued that they largely failed to deliver on these promises. But nonetheless, they have been successful in normalizing and globalizing educational discourses and policy agendas. And there's also a lack of scholarly attention to the interrelations between international organizations. As Cranky wrote in a paper, the strive for uniqueness within spheres of overlapping authority makes the view that international organizations can be studied in isolation untenable. Of course, the book has significant limitations. It focuses on these three arguably important organizations, UNESCO, the OECD, and the World Bank, but there are, of course, others, such as UNICEF or international development banks, bilateral agencies that we don't look at least not as the focus of the research. And the book, because it is also historically a historical book, focuses on the era of US American dominance. There's also a lack of adequate attention to micro perspectives. So in terms of how global influences play out in countries and how national and local actors engage with these international organizations and global agendas. So we do not pay enough attention to that, but we say that this is very important and this is an important research agenda. So chapter 1 is an introduction to global governance of education from a theoretical perspective. And this is a quote from the book. So the perspective of global governance emerged as a reaction to the limitations of the realist school of international relations, with its focus on the centrality of national interests as the main driver of the world order. And the global governance perspective was very much coined by this book by Rosenau and Champiel, Governance Without Government. And since the 1990s, these realist theories seemed increasingly inadequate to explain the rising influence of non-state actors, technology, and the shifting dynamics of globalization. And the global governance perspective is non-hierarchical in the sense that an international organization could be an equally influential actor than a nation state or a corporate actor, for example. There is a core periphery pattern in that there are concepts that are being, ideas that are being conceptualized by bigger or older international organizations, and then they move into the periphery. Such as lifelong learning is such an example and then also this aspect of promissory legitimacy, that international organizations build their authority on promises, on future promises. And And we also discuss constructivist, materialist, and political economy theories of the global governance of education. And then chapter 2 gives an overview of the three international organizations that we focus on, and looks at their epistemic and ontological underpinnings. So we label UNESCO as the idealist because of its norm setting, human rights frameworks and declarations. And it also coordinates some global development agendas such as SDG 4, education for all. Then we label the OECD as the master of persuasion because it derives its authority from the generation of expert knowledge and research, and exerts soft power through the use of indicators, benchmarks, and comparative rankings that build up peer pressure. And we label the World Bank the master of coercion because the World Bank's policy influence is financially driven, and the loans that the World Bank provides to countries are tied to conditions. So there is a coercive element there. And then chapter 3 focuses on the Cold War era. It delves into the early years of educational planning in developing countries and analyzes the connections and turf struggles between UNESCO and the OECD, as well as the rise of the international expert in the production and legitimation of knowledge that came to underpin the global governance of education. So this was kind of the era where there were many intersections between international organizations, the US government, philanthropic foundations, and universities that formed a powerful network from which a global governance architecture emerged. Chapter 4 focuses on the turf struggles between UNESCO and the World Bank over the field of education for development, and has 2 sections. The first section focuses on the cooperative program between the 2 organizations between the 1960s and the 1980s. And the second section focuses on the Education for All initiative in the 1990s. Chapter 5 sheds light on the collaboration and competition between UNESCO, the OECD, and the World Bank with regard to education statistics, which became a tool of the global governance of education. And chapter 6 provides a critical analysis of the OECD's and UNESCO's engagement with lifelong learning as a policy concept. And the chapter demonstrates how, in the context of the economic crisis and change of the political climate in the second half of the 1970s and the 1980s, with the shift towards neoliberalism, the lifelong learning movement was crowded out by the pursuit of education indicators and the measurement of skills, which then yielded the OECD's ENES program, and then ultimately PISA. And chapter 7 represents an analysis of UNESCO, the OECD, and the World Bank as a social network. And we focus on 3 what we call case arenas: the creation of the International Institute for Educational Planning, the travels and correspondence of Matt Sultin, who was a World Bank staffer, and the role of Andreas Schleicher, who is the director of PISA. And then in chapter 8, the concluding chapter, we tie everything together, and reiterate our key arguments, and focus on some contemporary developments such as multi-stakeholderism that we will talk a little bit more about today. So now I'm handing over to Christian, who is going to present the main findings of the book.
Thank you very much, Maren, and also thanks from me for the invitation. Yeah, so I will sort of sum up and elaborate a bit on the key findings of the book. So over the past decades, we have witnessed a decisive shift in the landscape of global education governance. So UNESCO, which was once envisioned as the leading intellectual agency with democratic mandate to steer education policy globally, has gradually lost its central role to more technocratically driven organizations such as the OECD and the World Bank. But this displacement, importantly, is not merely institutional. It reflects deeper transformations in the governance of education itself, while UNESCO's agenda focused on ideals like international understanding and educational humanism. The OECD and the World Bank rose to prominence by aligning with dominant economic ideologies and leveraging tools like performance indicators, assessment regimes, and result-based management. A critical dimension of this change lies in the interactions between international organizations and powerful states. Western nations, particularly the United States, have historically favored international organizations like the OECD and the World Bank, where governance structures reflect their interests. These interactions shape not only funding patterns, but also normative agendas and operational priorities. UNESCO, on the other hand, has always been notoriously underfinanced, and quite often because of United States and the United Kingdom's unwillingness to sufficiently finance UNESCO programs. Then there's a dimension around the global agendas, such as education for all, as you know, since 1990, the Millennium Development Goals since 2000, and now SDG 4 since 2015. They play a central role in orchestrating international cooperation. But we argue in Chapter 8, these frameworks often function more as instruments of institutional legitimacy and agenda-setting power than as genuinely transformative commitments. They produce what we call, or might be termed, false universalisms, rhetorics of inclusion that obscure the realities of inequality and power asymmetry. Another key element in this evolving governance is the boundary work, the strategic construction and negotiation of juridical spaces between IOs. Conferences, partnerships, and data regimes become arenas in which international organizations vie for relevance and authority, often leading to overlapping mandates and mission creep. We found, for instance, that both the IIEP and CERI within the OECD historically have constituted important sites of boundary work because of their semi-autonomous positions. This struggle has given rise to what we call homogenizing effects and isomorphic tendencies, meaning that UNESCO, the OECD, and the World Bank, despite their different founding missions, have all sort of converged on similar technocratic models, privileging quantitative metrics over qualitative understanding. The result is a narrowing of educational priorities to what can be measured, usually literacy and numeracy, but we'll come back to that in our thoughts about the future. But that happens at the expense of broader social, cultural, and equity-oriented goals. So finally, we're seeing a structural transformation in the very nature of governance, from a multilateral system centered on nation states to a multi-stakeholder model dominated by transnational actors, philanthropic foundations, private corporations, so on. Initiatives like the Global Partnership for Education exemplify this shift. So while framed as inclusive multi-stakeholder governance often lacks democratic accountability and exacerbates the marginalization of less powerful actors. So in conclusion, we find the governance of education is becoming increasingly complex, very layered, and always contested. As researchers and practitioners, we must remain vigilant. We must always remember to ask who sets the agenda, who benefits, and who is left unheard. So that concludes my summary of the findings of the book. So I'll give the word back to Maren.
Okay, thank you, Christian. So let me talk about some contemporary issues that I have been working on. I have co-authored a paper with my doctoral student, Praveen Balakrishnan, who I think is also in the meeting. By the way, I wanted to say hello to all of the students who are here. It's lovely to see you. or to know that you are in the same meeting, let's say. And so this paper is about crisis narratives as drivers of the shifts in the global governance of education. And the crisis narrative has a long history in education, and we write about that. There was the Sputnik shock of the 1950s, and then there was the world education crisis in the 50s, and the world education crisis in the 1960s. And The Nation at Risk, for example, the American report in the 1980s that kind of led to shifts in the global governance of education, to more influence for the OECD, for example. But the crisis narrative seems to be increasing and accelerating. So several recent reports by UNESCO, the OECD, and the World Bank, as well as other actors of the global governance of education, have presented the future as crisis-prone and risky, uncontrollable. And rather than asking questions about how we ended up in this situation or what these international organizations might have, how they might have contributed to this situation, the responsibility is being placed on learners to acquire a crisis-prone skill set in which concepts such as social and emotional learning, concepts such as mindfulness that come from different contexts, and also resilience take a central role. Some key initiatives in this regard are the OECD's Future of Education and Skills Agenda, which promotes the flourishing, human flourishing. The human flourishing is the high performance systems for tomorrow. And the OECD's Future of Education and Skills has also more of this a turn towards non-cognitive perspectives in education. An example of a contemporary crisis narrative in education is the World Bank's Learning Crisis and Learning Poverty agenda. And learning poverty is defined as the inability of 10-year-olds to read and understand a simple text. The Learning Poverty Initiative involves a new learning target by 2030, reduced by at least half the share of 10-year-olds who cannot read. And it signals, as Clara Fontevilla writes, a certain comeback of the spirit of the Millennium Development Goals, the preference for a narrow, simple goal. The construction of global learning metrics shaped the scope of the global learning crisis and placed all countries in a single scale, ignoring the historical and cultural background and the intricate structures of education systems. As remarked by one of Clara Fontevilla's interviewees, it's part of the whole process of narrowing of the outcomes of learning. World Bank's Human Capital Project and the Human Capital Index. And these standardized metrics are easy to understand for policymakers. Although the World Bank has signed a memorandum of understanding with the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, which is in charge of monitoring the SDG 4 agenda, so the World Bank formally collaborates with the SDG 4 architecture. The Learning Poverty Agenda has been referred to by some as an instance of counter-targeting and mission creep. This is again from Clara Fontevilla's research. It represents a kind of parallel agenda to the official SDG 4 monitoring architecture. The learning poverty narrative took center stage through the report, The State of Global Learning Poverty, 2022 update, which you can see here on the slide, which was launched by a multi-stakeholder partnership involving the World Bank, UNICEF, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the UK, USAID, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, also in collaboration with UNESCO. So there is there's also a shift towards data and edtech, which play a major role as strategies to tackle the learning poverty crisis. And in that regard, learning poverty could be considered a multi-stakeholder agenda promoted by international organizations that enables edtech to infiltrate the education space. The learning poverty discourse reinforces the authority of private actors in shaping educational futures in low-income countries and diminishes the role of democratically accountable institutions. And so at the moment, the digitalization of education is presented as a panacea to the learning crisis, of course, exacerbated by the COVID period. International organizations partner with edtech companies, opening up markets and influence for them in the global governance space. Examples are UNESCO's Global Education Coalition during COVID and the World Bank's Digital Development Partnerships. And we see a clear trend to these, Christian already mentioned that, to these multi-stakeholder partnerships. The EdTech is another example. Again, the EdTech Hub, which is here on the slide as well, again, including World Bank, UNICEF, USAID, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which aims to generate evidence on technologies used in the classroom. And these multi-stakeholder arrangements go along with the financialization, increasing financialization of education, innovative education financing models, and edtech-focused initiatives. So techno-solutionism is opening the global education space to corporate actors and influence. And we discuss in the paper, Pravin and I, and also in a previous paper that I wrote with you and Old, that a key difference between past and present crisis narratives lies in their relationship to the future. In the post-World War II and Cold War eras, crises were linked to visions of progress. So there was a crisis, but there was a promise for the future that was being made. So, for example, during Sputnik, it was defending capitalism from communism, or in the case of education at risk, it was promoting global competitiveness through neoliberal reforms. And today we are witnessing, we are not seeing these really promises for the future anymore. It's just, so there is a shift in, or a qualitative difference, that it's just a world in perpetual crisis. So there is an acceleration of the present that we observe, where historical continuity and future political alternatives are being eroded. One last point that I wanted to make is the rise of multipolarity and the new global powers. It's important to look at the global and the global governance of education also from an epistemological perspective. There was a recent special issue published in Comparative Education edited by Brent Edwards on the global education policy field that interrogates the theoretical foundations of the global education policy field, also taking into consideration its symbolic, its ontological, epistemic, religious, and spiritual dimensions that are often overlooked. And I think that's a very important perspective. So to summarize, we are seeing multi-stakeholder arrangements involving private and not democratically legitimized actors that are being legitimized by crisis narratives, a focus on edtech and narrow metrics, and new visions of the global and rearrangements of global governance structures. But it is not clear whether these will actually lead to more diversity or to more conformity. There is a lot of debate about the new multipolar order right now with the rise of China, geopolitical shifts, and what will it bring in terms of alternative concepts of the global in relation to education policy promoted by China, for example? So China has an alternative vision of the global, which is often referred to as this Tianxia perspective, all under heaven. There's quite a lot of literature on Tianxia as a form of soft power in relation to the Belt and Road Initiative and the expansion of higher education. Another interesting example is India's approach to participation in the OECD's PISA study, which is a key, of course, a key global education policy instrument. India participated in PISA, didn't do well, and then pulled out. Said it was because of COVID. Wanted to rejoin, but is maybe not rejoining now because of ideological differences. So these are all interesting alternative perspectives on the global. And it's important also to investigate the relationships of the new global powers with international organizations. For example, China's influence on UNESCO, especially in the field of artificial intelligence, that deepened during the absence of the United States since 2011. And now the United States has rejoined UNESCO, and UNESCO is the site of a kind of head-to-head between these two superpowers. Questions that I think are important to explore are: what is the impact of the current geopolitical shift towards a multipolar world order on the consensus over global agendas and instruments in education policy? And how are imaginaries of the global negotiated between new global powers and international organizations? And this, of course, has also implications for the post-2030 agenda. So I'll hand over to Christian now.
Thank you very much, Maren. Yeah, so I will pick up the thread where Maren ended, so to say, talking a bit about these reshufflings of the political order in the world. I drew up this little model here to, maybe it's helpful in terms of thinking about the multi-stakeholder landscape. And I think that what we see here between a national arena, a school arena, an international arena, and certain institution and actors who are hovering above it all, like the philanthropic foundations, the media, and the edtech industry. That's exactly what's now becoming reshuffled in many ways. So to pick up the thread from Maren, I would say that the question is also, how will it be possible to build a constituency for education in the future that will place education as a relevant field and with a transformative power in the world? I think that's actually where we are now. So let's move on to the next slide. It's because Maren is controlling the slide. So yeah, anyway, I also want to share with you a work that I did with a PhD student, Elisaveta Ebner, from my team. I should say this is not published yet anyway, but in that paper, we really tried to look at how the international organizations have gone from crisis to crisis. And certainly now we find ourselves in a crisis situation where these organizations may have to or be forced to reinvent themselves. So there's an interesting point here in looking back at what has actually constituted previous crises. So I would like to unpack a bit how international organizations in education have operated within what we call in this paper a contested ideological space, defined by nationalism, universalism, and cosmopolitanism, three frameworks that continue to influence global education policy and governance today. Since the interwar period, intergovernmental organizations have not been neutral actors. They've positioned themselves within this ideological triangle, adapting both their policies and their narratives used to legitimize them. So let me start with universalism. This framework assumes that certain values like peace, justice, human dignity are globally valid and should be promoted through education across all societies. This is an idea that very much gained momentum after World War I and became foundational for initiatives like human rights education. Universalism underpinned much of the early work of the International Bureau of Education, founded in 1925, and which promoted cross-national curriculum harmonization and teacher training. Cosmopolitanism is often aligned with universalism, but it gained renewed attention in the post-Cold War era. It advances ideals like global citizenship, shared ethics, transnational institutions, but cosmopolitanism is not ideologically neutral. It often assumes elite forms of mobility and access, fluency in global languages, international schooling, financial resources. In education, it has contributed to the making of what could be called a global middle class, through international schools and elite universities. So this creates also an exclusionary dynamics, even within supposedly inclusive global education agendas. And that plays into a very big contrast with nationalism, because there's this elite that would like to tell more supposedly traditional segments of the population how to live their lives, what kind of values they should have. I think that's part of the reason why Trump came back into office in the United States. Basically flyover countries' criticism of the coast regions of the United States value codes. So nationalism, that insists really on the sovereign control of education by the nation state. It views global frameworks with suspicion, often seeing them as foreign impositions that threaten national identity or autonomy. It's a persistent counterforce to both universalist and cosmopolitan ideals, and it's been working. It's been had its workings ever since the whole 20th century, for sure. It's important to emphasize that these frameworks do not exist in isolation. They clash, they overlap, they recalibrate over time. So, for instance, while UNESCO has traditionally promoted a humanistic and universalist education agenda, it has historically been criticized for its lack of sound measurable outputs. This has measured or pressured the organization to embrace these data-driven governance, as we talked about before. But an example here could be this global alliance to monitor learning, aligning itself, perhaps reluctantly, with the OECD's long-standing emphasis on quantification. The OECD, for its part, you could argue, has been invested in a globalized form of what could be called extrapolated nationalism. A good example here is the Nation at Risk report from 1983, which really made the US pursue an agenda of having international comparative indicators and actually embedding that project in the OECD. And that was the ENIS project that Maren mentioned before, which eventually also fed into PISA. But that began kind of as a domestic crisis in the United States, but then developed into becoming a global benchmark. So that's really what's meant with this extrapolation of nationalism. So it's a specific form that nationalism can take in terms of global governance. So this ideological struggle is not just abstract because it affects legitimacy. IGOs, we argue, as you can see in the model here, they gain legitimacy not merely by promoting ideals, but by delivering observable results. So, for instance, the dissolution of the International Bureau of Education's autonomy in 1969, when it was swallowed by UNESCO, is a case in point. Despite its universalist mission, it failed to convincingly reconcile national demands with global ambitions. So ultimately, what we see is that crisis plays a central role in this dynamic, as Maren also emphasized. Every legitimacy crisis for IGOs tend to mirror a broader ideological crisis within the international order. So when that reshuffles, the organizations will have to also reshuffle or reconfigure these three terms here: universalism, cosmopolitanism, and nationalism. To conclude on this part, international education governance is fundamentally shaped by ongoing tensions between these three parts: nationalism, universalism, and cosmopolitanism. So they are not resolved, but they are continuously renegotiated, with education acting as a key site where visions of global order are tested, resisted, and reimagined. So that was just one attempt at making some kind of historical analysis. So let's move on to the next point I want to make, which is basically about education itself. Because I think another feature, of course, I agree about this whole about the technology influx and the importance of the edtech industry. You will also see technology feature in this little slide here. But the thing is that there are so many other disciplines that are very busy in telling education what to do, telling it what education is and should be. So historically, we've had theology, but now we have very much biology, the life sciences. I'm coming back to that in a minute, but a lot of other fields that are sort of trying to define or even colonize what education is. At the same time, education has to struggle with a lot of other societal concerns, geopolitical situations, the production of citizenship. We talked about the technology, the data and the metrics, part of that, the governing by numbers, educationalization of social problems, accountability in the broader field of public policy, and market and capital, of course, also. So it's just a way to start thinking about what actually comes from education and how can education provide perhaps an answer to some of these things. So if you look in the box of what's grown in the garden of education, you could say it's things like pedagogy, Bildung, didactics, curriculum, learning, and to some extent also history of education, philosophy of education. So what comes out of that composition in response to all these other agendas or priorities and other disciplines that are coming in? I think that's something that we need to think about when trying to answer that question I raised before about how can we actually build a constituency in a shifting world order that will allow education to remain relevant and as with a transformative force. So let's move on to the next slide, which is just an example of this, because I think I want to emphasize this, because I think, well, we just had a really great workshop in Milan about this topic. And then, yeah, Maren, if you just press so all the bullets come up. Maren also talked about social emotional learning, but what we see here is kind of an influx of gene learning, precision learning, neurobiology, neuroscience, neuropedagogy, which is basically about how you can translate research findings on neural mechanisms to educational practice, to understand the effects of education on the brain. We have this idea about how life is an intelligence test. It comes from Robert Plomin here, who's a very prominent geneticist. And of course, there's a resonance here with old trends in eugenics and so on. So these ideas, I think, have not died out, but they might now reappear in a new guise. We see also within UNESCO how this Reimagining Education report from the Mahatma Gandhi Center advocates the reorientation of curricula. It's full of neurologically infected whole brain, learner-centric education for human flourishing. And this strand, in a way, has always been there. I mean, it has a long history. It even goes back to Thorndike in the 20s, you know, when he was a professor at Teachers College, Columbia. And then came in 1990s, the decade of the brain and all that. So it's just one example of a very powerful influx of a discipline that is also connected with and aligned with the tech industry, the life sciences, and so on that come into education. And I think that could potentially actually transform the education field. But that remains to be seen. Let's move on to my final point here, just to say something about the OECD as an example of this. Like the other organizations, it finds itself at a crossroad. It currently has this leading position, but it's being challenged. There's a volatile geopolitical landscape, the multipolar world order, as Maren also talked about, political discontent, resurgent nationalism, climate change pressures, and admittedly, the OECD has always had a very big historical capacity for reinvention. But the core challenges for an organization like that is how to maintain legitimacy, how to maintain authority, how to maintain influence in education amidst this global uncertainty. So that moves on to the final slide. So sort of where is the OECD at right now? So we see, of course, that goes a few years back, a significant expansion of PISA-related offerings, the PISA for You, PISA for D, PISA for schools, PISA for 5-year-olds, an increasing inclusion of both member and non-member countries. Then we have the strain, the criticism, PISA fatigue, critiques, questions against PISA's relevance, validity, global applicability. Certainly there's been a lot of that. So the question is now how the OECD tries to recalibrate its education agendas. Maren also mentioned this high-performing systems for tomorrow, the Education and Skills 2030 framework, where the emphasis is on holistic education. And to me, at least very surprisingly, this human flourishing seems to be also inspired by Buddhism, Confucianism, and Ubuntu philosophy. At least that's what they write. From a cynical perspective, you could say, well, maybe this is to say that we recognize or we understand the global South is going to be more powerful and influential. So we want to make sure that we make clear that we have actually oriented us towards or taken into account philosophies from other parts of the world. So to avoid the criticism of being just a Western capitalist liberal economic organization. There's a lot of focus on student agency, societal well-being, resilience, such things. We see that in the Teaching Compass 2030, the Learning Compass 2030, which has a very sort of ecosystem approach to education. It actually places the student very much in the center. I think, Maren, you also mentioned this. So at least according to an analysis by Susan Robertson, that's also a reinvention of a neoliberal mode of operation, where it's actually the student who has to develop all these social emotional skills to be resilient in the world of tomorrow. Some of the new tools, Global Teaching Insight, very, very huge project featuring thousands and thousands of hours of video recordings from classrooms all over the world to sort of distill what works in the classroom. And also this education GPS platform, where you can now at your fingertips on your smartphone see the latest real-time developments of Malaysia's reading scores, just to give one example. So there's a lot of things going on concretely if you focus on the OECD and how it tries to reinvent itself and navigate this new situation. These were just some thoughts and reflections, musings on the contemporary and future situation. So that concludes my talk. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I'm sure there's a lot of questions because there's a lot of things that you've mentioned which are very, very, very interesting for most of us that are working on educational governance and policy. So I'm just going to open this time for questions, and we have 15 minutes for discussion. So we've already one question from John. And Florian, maybe we can have 2 questions and then you answer. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So, John?
Yes. Thank you, Maren and Christian. And I'm particularly interested, I think, in the last part of your presentation, because as all of you, I guess, I'm very occupied by the question, what happens to this world order that has also become an educational world order, very much shaped by US dominance, that has been universalized, and we've almost been blind maybe to how it's not really universal, but very much a Western world order. And what happens? I think, Maren, you went into it with Chinese and Indian reactions, but I feel very much in our debates that we hear a lot about the OECD, the EU, and the Bologna process, and so on and so forth, and the World Bank. But what is happening with this parallel structure that we don't hear very much about like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank as a parallel to the Bretton Woods institutions, and to BRICS and so on and so forth. Do you see, what would you call it, developments like in India and China that we're not aware of, because we're mostly aware of maybe that they drop out of PISA and things like that? That's one thing. And the other thing, Christian, which really excited me, is that this mentioning of Buddhism, Confucianism, and Ubuntu. Are there any more specific ways or like structures or like streams that you see anywhere where that kind of seeps in a more credible way? Or is it just a way of making, what would you call it, people happy more globally? I don't expect you can really answer those questions, but you seem to have very good feeling of the landscape.
Mm. Thank you, John. It's good to see you. Your questions are exactly mine. I think this is very, we don't know, well, some might know, and I know that there are students who are getting into these fields. I think we really need to know more about what other structures are, more influential in the realm of China, for example, of East Asia and so on, and we don't know enough about that. And I wanted to, and you're absolutely right. I think that's really important. And I also wanted to say something about the Ubuntu and mindfulness and all of this in the OECD's skills strategy for the one that I was on the slide, Learning and Skills Strategy 2030 or so. There is a page where the OECD mentions several educational concepts that they think are important for the future. Mindfulness is one of them, and lots of these like empathy and things. And then when you read, they say, when you read the text, they say that ultimately what they want to do is measure these things, right? So it's, yeah. So how meaningful are these? Is the engagement with these concepts if the ultimate aim is to measure? Maybe Christian has some other ideas on what you just said.
No, it's a very good point, Maren, because I think to me it's very sort of sugarcoating to say that we have oriented ourselves towards these things, but at the end of the day, they still want to measure the individual, which is not very Ubuntu, which is very much about the community before the individual and so on. So yeah, I mean, but on the other hand, maybe we should not write it off completely, because I think we do see some initiatives like with the NORAC that had this hashtag called the South also knows. So there is this point that you have to listen, to be more attentive to and involving in for the global South. So if you want to survive, that's really a condition as an international organization. So there might be something in the structure that will promote this more. But right now, to me, it's more like sugarcoating, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So now
there was
Sorry.
another thing John said, also asked about. I just want to say, you asked about the BRICS and all that. I would just say that so far, it seems that China, as Maren also mentioned, they have been very active within UNESCO. So I don't really see that BRICS and these other alternative networks or organizations are offering some kind of an alternative yet. But we will see. We will see.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Okay, thank you. So Florian.
Yeah. First of all, sorry for being late, but this world of back-to-back meetings sort of easily gets derailed. It's great to see it, fantastic to listen to this masterful overview. I would like to, however, push back a little bit on a point, sort of one of the basic premises I think your presentation was built on, Christian. And if you've already answered that in your part, Maren, tell me, no, you should have been there on time, shut up. and that was this slide, you know, with this cardboard box where all these other disciplines put stuff in, and you even said you could even call it colonizing, but the field of education proper being colonized by other disciplines. And I've got two questions, or more of a comment in that concern. The first one is, what's the field of education proper? I mean, sometime, like I was wondering whether and I was trying to kind of arrive at a definition of what you really base this on, and sorry, I'm sort of deliberately exaggerating a bit, but it surely can't just be a collection of beliefs about education that most of us happen to hold, and that maybe Andreas Schleicher doesn't. Also, it's very, very hard to delimit this field. And building on that, that's the second point. Couldn't you also make the opposite case, that education tells other fields what to do? And why is the educationalization of social problems other disciplines colonizing us rather than us colonizing them? I mean, certainly in practical terms, we benefit massively from that. There wouldn't be 1,000 professors of education in Germany if youth delinquency, sustainable development, and all these things hadn't been educationalist. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm on political grounds. I'm totally against as a citizen. I'm totally against that. But as an educationalist, I have to say, great, gives me lots of job opportunities. That what we are supposed to be experts in is what's kind of is given as the silver bullet to other fields. So I was I was wondering a bit on what are your thoughts on that? So A, what's the field of education proper that can be colonized by others? And B, isn't there also, couldn't you also make a case for like the education being the ones who put this stuff into all these other cardboard boxes?
Yeah, thanks, Florian. That's a really great question. And I mean, of course, it goes back, and you of all people know how, historically there's been all these debates about what is actually education or pedagogy. Is it a field in its own right, or is it just some kind of an appendix to another field? And that goes back for, a very long centuries, really. So my point with that is not to say that there aren't any fruitful interactions with other fields. It's more to say that if we want to think about how education can maybe provide some answers for the world of tomorrow, we have to also look a bit inward. And inward, with that, I try to say that, didactics, curriculum, Bildung, all these things or pedagogy, these things that sort of come from within what we would normally recognize as the field of education. We need to also look at that and see if there are any answers there, because in any kind of interdisciplinary endeavor, you have also to have, as an educationalist, a platform of your own to stand on. You cannot just borrow space in the other platforms, right? So, I mean, that's one thing. And are we colonizing the others? Interesting question, Florian. I would say, well, I mean, in any kind of merger between or interdisciplinary activity, there will certainly be some things from education that also flows into other areas, for sure, understandings, concepts, and so on. But I would just still be a bit concerned because of the funding structures that we now see with the whole this life science strand that I'm talking about. They get much more funding than education as such, unless they take over education. That's the question. And so it's also with the ed tech and the technology, and so they are much more powerful. So yeah. On a structural level, I would not think that we are colonizing the others. I think that education is being, colonized, even though I recognize it might be too strong a word to talk about colonization as such. Thanks for raising it, Florian.
Okay, is there any, Maren, do you want to make also a remark on this?
Well, no, I just had one association while Christian was, thank you, Florian, for coming, was about AI, right? So I just had a discussion with somebody who is not an education person about AI, and I was complaining about the essays that are now AI generated, and then the comment was, but you are the education, like you are in education. like you should have the answer to this, like how you know, like how can we deal with this, how can we support students and so on, and then that's exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking, well, do I really have the ownership of this? Do I really have, or is it more, let's say, AI colonizing, you know, education, you know, like this is just a thought that came into my mind about, yeah, anyway, let's move on. Maybe we have time for one more question. That would be great. If people could hang on for a few more minutes.
I was looking for our audience and no
or
one...
a comment, doesn't have to be.
Okay, if no one wants to raise the hand, I will. I have a question. Well, it's not a question, it's something that I was thinking about, and I've been working, and Anna Tsatsaroni, she's also here. We've been working lately about this European initiative, the Next Generation, and the national resilient plans that every country in the European Union have to submit. And you talked about how the crisis and the crisis narrative is opening the door for the international organization and even other private actors to become relevant, or even more relevant, in educational governance. And we are looking at this initiative by the European Commission, and it also has been framed as to solve the crisis. You know, the idea of the crisis, of the pandemic crisis, of the economic crisis in the European Union. And for the first time, the Commission opened this new economic and financial support for the countries, allowing them to overlap the national debt. And we are trying to think about how this crisis has also become an opportunity for new modes to govern, not only the education, but of course also the education. And in a way, how the governments are also trying to reconcert, to become more in control, shall we say, about the way that the money flows within the European space. So the crisis is also serving for, do you think this is, does it make sense? The crisis is not only for international organizations, but also for the national governments to operate differently in at least in the European space.
This is really interesting, Sophia. I didn't know about this. And what are these national resilience plans about?
Well, they allow that. Anna, do you want to join in? Maybe yes. Anna, you're mute.
I'm not sure you can hear.
Now we can. Oh, no.
So I was trying to find how to raise my hand.
Maybe you should just try to.
Yeah, we could just hear her.
We hear you very, very, very slow, far away.
Okay, in that case,
Better, that's better.
I will leave it to you to say really what the problem is. But we thought that the recovery and resilience plans at the level of the EU and the way they are, the member states are responding to this is itself a very interesting, a very similar to what Maren and Christian were talking about when you are talking about crisis. The crisis of this at the level of international organizations. So yeah, some responses to that we would like to hear.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll look into that. Thank you.
So if there's no more questions, oh, there's one. Klaus.
Yes, thank you very much. If there's still time, I would like to ask a question.
Let's take one more and then, yeah, we'll let you go.
Okay. So I have a question about the connection between the internationally recognized ideologies, such as cosmopolitanism, universalism, and nationalism, and the international organizations. So if these values are challenged internationally, the international organizations are also in crisis because they are based on these values. Do you see other values coming that could fit in here and become the foundations for international organizations? Or is it just everything's falling apart here?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the question. And we don't know that yet, I think we are in a transition period right now. And we need to see how this plays out. I mean, for example, just that the OECD throws mindfulness in the picture, right? In the pot, which is a concept that comes from Buddhism and has its own ontology and philosophy. Shows that they're trying to reach out more, right? Like beyond the Western horizon, as some people have written, or also Confucianism comes up more in scholarly literature and so on. But Christian was talking about that. How is the OECD going to reshape itself this time, right? It has been very successful in reinventing itself over the course of history. How is it going to do it this time? Like with PISA, this human flourishing concept in the PISA for the higher high-performing systems for tomorrow. They wrote in the website and the reports that this is kind of replacing the human capital theory approach that the OECD has always been, has underpinned the OECD's work and thinking. So here we go, right? There's already some attempts to reshape their identity. But how it's going to play out, I think it's interesting times, often depressing times, but interesting times right now. What we're going, we'll see. Christian, do you have any?
No, I mean that's a very interesting question, Catherine, and maybe the resilience can also come on the table, like to connect with also what Sophia and Anna talked about. But I still don't see that, they cannot escape this fundamental issue about, are we trying to promote this universally? And what do we do about national interests and this delicate balance between the member states and other sort of more nationalistically oriented stakeholders? And it very quickly evolves into this cosmopolitanism where it's like, this is the right way of doing it, and we are educating people to be in a certain way. So no matter what you put on the plate is still there. If you want to have an international organization, it by default will demand that there is some kind of universalism in what it does, because it doesn't make sense to have an international organization for just one nation state. Obviously, that's not possible, right? So it's really, but it's a very good question. What goes on the plate, right? That remains to be seen.
Okay, so thank you a lot. Thank you again, Maren and Christian, and thank you all for your participation. Hope to see you very soon in our next conference in Belgrade at SR. Javier is preparing the program, so let's hope to see you all there, and thank you all very much again.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all for
Bye-bye.
coming. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye all.